based blockchain exchange. And next to working there, where I mostly focus on financial market law and the classification of cryptocurrencies and tokens, I do research on smart contracts, also as a member of the Dynamic Coalition on blockchain technologies. With me as well, I'm stepping in. I wasn't originally planned to hold this session. I'm stepping in for Carla Reyes, who's a associate professor at Stetson University in Florida, and unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, she couldn't make it either. So it's all a bit unplanned and new, but I'm pretty sure we can make this a very interesting session. I'm going to give you a quick overview first of the work that our Dynamic Coalition has been doing. And so the Dynamic Coalition on Blockchain Technologies brings together blockchain experts in a very interdisciplinary fashion. So all the people who participate in this coalition, they range from information scientists, economists, lawyers, and philosophers, all from different levels, either academia, governmental institutions, or private economy. So we do have a lot of people who are in blockchain startups. We have people from a lot of blockchain foundations with their own proprietary blockchain. And so we regularly convene all of these people together and work in these different working groups that we've established. And here too, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the working groups that our Dynamic Coalition currently has. So the first working group that we maintain is the blockchain and government. And this group looks at the implications of blockchain technologies in the field of government and public institutions. We there explore current implementations of blockchain-based applications to support the development of transparent and incorruptible systems. So this will be, how can we use blockchain technology to facilitate the issuance of passports, etc., verify people's identity, bring the land registry on the blockchain, etc. The second working group that we maintain is the blockchain governance group. And this working group looks at the implications of blockchain technologies in the field of governance. However, I'm not going to go into that more deeply because this is the main topic of today's session. The third working group that we do is the identity group. In the identity group, we review the very comprehensive research that exists on different blockchain identity systems. And so we particularly focus on the challenges and risks of leveraging blockchain technology for identity solutions, as well as the security and privacy considerations that may need to be taken into account. Because it's a very paradox issue, identity and blockchain. Because if you think about it at the conceptual level, when it came into existence, it was meant to allow people who are in an anonymous relationship to each other enter into transactions without the need to trust each other or a trusted intermediary. However, at the same time, blockchain technology can be used for very adversarial or things which are quite the opposite, which would allow people to have complete transparency over all identity and have that stored on the blockchain. So it's a very thin line, and it's very, very important to stress identity and privacy matters when using blockchain technology, because it can be used to a great extent to facilitate every interaction that a government has with its citizen based on identity. For example, with the technology such as zero-knowledge proof, which allows for the receiver to validate that the person is in fact entitled to whatever they seek permission to, for example, enter into a country, without the need to expose the actual data or information. So that's what this working group is doing. Then the fourth working group is the one on legal enforceability of smart contracts. We there analyze the issues which are related to the legal validity and the enforceability of smart contracts. Basing on the questions, are a smart contract actual contracts? Because a lot of people argue they're neither smart nor are they actual contracts. And we there explore the correlations between smart contracts and legal contracts, what happens when they differ, and yes. And the fifth working group, which I'm personally part of, is the one on ICOs and token generating events. We there explore the current regulatory landscape which affects the operations of blockchain-based networks and startups which want to do fundraising in this space. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure you guys are all aware of the whole ICO craze which happened in 2017, more or less, and all the regulatory implications this has grow more important. And all governments, because this is an inherently global issue, will have to come to a finding and a common solution on how to deal with these events. And therefore, we currently in this group are discussing the coming into existence of a regulation C for regulation cryptocurrency. And we are working on several submissions to foreign governments. So, for example, the Autorité Marché Financier in France published a consultation paper where they want industry participants to submit their idea of an ideal cryptocurrency regulation. And we're currently just finishing this submission paper. We will submit it on December 22nd to the AMF, where we propose a new regulatory framework, mostly based on the concept of functional equivalence, something which we will come to discuss at a later stage. So today's schedule is the following. It has been, as I said, changed a little bit due to unforeseen circumstances. But what we will do in the beginning is we will listen to a speech of Henning Diedrich, which is a very renowned blockchain expert, as food for thought. And this is something where, you know, we want everybody to get on the same level and use this as an input for the further discussions. In the second part, if we're going to manage to get Vlad from the airport online, we're going to have get his understanding of blockchain governance. What is his concept of blockchain governance? Because he has a very distinct concept of it compared to other exponents. And what his core elements and principles are, what he thinks a blockchain should be governed. And we're going to try to debunk some myths. We're going to make the differentiation between on-chain and off-chain governance, which is also very important. And we will then look at the core principles of blockchain governance, which we're going to establish in light of two distinct events which happened throughout the past 2 years, and we see how these governance structures dealt with these events. And these events are, on the one hand, the DAO hack, which happened in 2016, and as a result of which, and actually the underlying governance principles, the Ethereum blockchain hard forked. And the second event will be the transition from proof-of-work consensus mechanism to the proof-of-stake consensus mechanism at the example of the Ethereum blockchain, which is currently being introduced by Vlad Zamfir's innovation, the Casper algorithm. Yes. After defining that, and we all get a good grasp of blockchain governance, we'll move over to compare it to internet governance and corporate governance, and try to find out whether we can get some learnings from internet governance, which exists for far longer time than blockchain governance, and whether some norms and institutions which exist with regards to internet governance should be introduced to blockchain governance in general. All right. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Vlad, who will follow later. Vlad hails from Canada, and I'm sure some of you or many of you are familiar with him. He's a theoretical mathematician, and one of the core developers for the Ethereum Foundation. His work focuses on the consensus mechanism which underlie the Ethereum Foundation. And he's been working on the analysis and specification of a proof-of-stake consensus mechanism since 2014. And this work ultimately resulted in Casper, which will be the novel consensus mechanism which will be introduced. Yes. And he just recently published a paper on this, actually, Casper the Friendly Ghost, where the theoretical foundations of the Casper algorithm are laid out. Odysseus, unfortunately, cannot participate. It would have been very nice to have him here because he has done a lot of interesting work on blockchain governance, especially one of his papers where he looks at whether smart contracts made in heaven, hell, and the cloud in between, with two other members of our DC, Harald Stieber and James Hazard. However, we'll now move on to the audio piece which I talked about, and this is an audio piece by Henning Diedrich. Henning Diedrich, to give you a quick introduction to him, is a German programmer, and he's mostly known for being the architect of the Hyperledger blockchain. He's also working on his own project called Lexon, where he'll create an ecosystem for smart contracts, which will allow for the execution of legally agreed upon transactions. And his main invention there is that he created a meta language which will bridge the gap between the code of a smart contract and the prose text, which still oftentimes is the foundation of a legal contract.
The Benevolent Dictator is a well-loved trope in the open source world. It's how big and very successful projects have been nurtured, became successful, and in reality are sometimes still run today. The idea is that a super intelligent, maybe charismatic founder pulls all the shots. There's no governance at all, but the dictator is a good guy, and so it's all right. It's interesting that the benevolent dictators themselves might also find this all right, and in this be no different from the 18th century's absolute monarchs, who also had a feeling that it was destiny that they were in power. Back then it was God's will, now I suppose it's for the hastening of singularity. Either way, human beings are quite good at justifying in front of themselves when they have power. Bitcoin is a notable exception. The mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto left to new endeavors, understandable, who would like to stay too long in such a boring scientific niche without real-world application. And no perspective to ever make real money. You have to move on at some point, or maybe he died. Or maybe he has a different notion about what power is. But like the wars of the Diadochi after the death of Alexander the Great, Bitcoin is also now famous for poisonous infighting and the painful slowdown of progress in its development. Why has Bitcoin not developed into something like Ethereum? Why would a separate project be required to implement smart contracts like Ethereum now has? Vitalik Buterin, for all I know, first thought about how Bitcoin could be improved. Would Satoshi have looked at Vitalik's ideas and steered the development of Bitcoin in this direction? Would that be a better choice for the ecosystem on the whole, because it would have meant less competition? And after all, Ethereum made it a principle to invent as many new wheels as possible. When Ethereum suffered the DAO debacle, Vitalik's response was swift and decisive. He asked the exchanges to stop trading, and so they did. By the power of his fame and merits, he was able to rally the community and make one decision for it early on. There would be a response. Interestingly, his drive to look for and recognize a social consensus was not an ad hoc decision, but reflective of what Vitalik had written before. That a blockchain is ultimately a gathering of people who can at any time change the rules of automated consensus when social consensus to do so emerges. That consensus algorithms should not be seen as in any way superior to the evolved capacity of humans to reach consensus, but only as its cheap brother that can be more economic when the rules get very complex or decisions are needed en masse. And so the wholly programmed consensus of Ethereum was changed to reflect the wishes of the overwhelming majority of the community. The DAO was put out of existence and most of the haste was undone. But not a few people felt that that was a betrayal of the essence of what a blockchain should be. And fascinatingly, of course, some diehards stayed behind and formed Ethereum Classic on the principle that the first principle of blockchain be there be no hard forks. The initial mostly anonymous success of the hard fork turned out to not be lasting. It turned out to not be a very strong Nash equilibrium, as Casey Dietro remarked dryly. But the case of Ethereum Classic also shows in bright colors that it's really impossible to force the user community of a public blockchain to change collectively to something that no complete social consensus exists for. Blockchains are by nature libertarian. The participation in them is voluntary. The decision to follow the rules is a decision of the users, as Gavin Wood rightly remarks, and this is the difference between authoritarian systems and libertarian ones. And thus, there is this inherent liberty, not built into the system, but a reality because of how and who is running it. This inherent liberty that consists of the fact that anyone can leave if they don't like where it's going. However, is that actually true? If I have a lot of money in a blockchain, will I just leave? Especially if I'm locked in by the dread of capital gains tax if I pull out? Or because I have locked-in stake as a miner? Or more relevant, if governments pick up on blockchains and make it mandatory for certain things, what happens to the libertarian principle? Does the pure technology without voluntary aspects become the perfect dictatorship tool? Is the voluntary, uncensored participation the only libertarian aspect about blockchains, really? And the rest the most fascist rule-enforcing machine possible? This becomes very relevant when people think about putting IDs and permissions on the blockchain. The technical logic is that blockchain has this wonderful property of making permissions rescindable. Normally, if I have a paper passport or an electronic passport, it is difficult to take it away from me. I could successfully use my paper passport anywhere in the world, even after it may have been officially rescinded, because there are a few places that will actually check back with a central network that can verify my passport number. And there's no other useful way, really, to disseminate the information that my passport was rescinded. How should it work? Tell everyone in the whole world about it? The only way is to have a connection back to the central database that allows to determine whether my passport is in fact still valid. It is the same with electronic IDs. If I can show a signed certificate somewhere, it could be that it has been rescinded without anyone knowing. The blockchain could be the central arbiter for such revocation information. That task suits it really well, with a hoped-for added effect that I won't actually have to show my passport anymore that leaks my age and country of birth every time I show it, but that in the future, I could just show an electronic permission that leaks no data except that I should be allowed to do what I'm asking entry or permission for. If mechanisms like this are put on public blockchains, it is obvious that the freedom to opt out goes away. I will need to use this blockchain to be able to perform some basic citizens' activity. For driving a car, if my driving license is stored in it, for going to school, if my vaccination status is stored in it, for buying highly lethal recreational drugs that are eligible from a certain age. If I'm locked in like this to a blockchain, the question of governance becomes unavoidable. Can tasks like this be put on the public Ethereum blockchain, where by and large Vitalik's word, one day for, another against hard forks, basically carries the day? Or will we have government-run blockchains for such uses? Which then begs the notorious question, why a blockchain at all for this? Isn't a database good enough because we are asked to trust the government? But at any rate, who would be the miners or validators in such a scheme? If we want something in between, we might have to acknowledge the true power distribution in the current blockchains first. It's not as easy as one token, one vote. The power with public blockchains, though, is in the hand of the users, miners or validators, and its developers community and the foundation that finances development if there is one, and if the blockchain has cryptocurrency, we will be looking at token holders and also, very importantly, the exchanges. The exchanges are often overlooked, but Vitalik's reaction during the DAO hack revealed their power on the ground. It was to them he appealed to be the backstops, and it was them who later had the power to give Ethereum Classic a lease to life, the breakaway community that did not want to follow on the Ethereum hard fork. It just takes one miner to continue a proof-of-work chain, but it was because Ethereum Classic became listed on the exchanges that anyone took note at all. Of course, a blockchain cannot even exist without the miners, and in this respect, they can be said to wield even more power. And the concentration of hashing power that is relevant to lead the block creation and the consensus process is even more troubling. Now, if a blockchain has no users, it's literally useless at any rate. But as we saw, users might be obliged to use the chain in the future. Then what will their relative power be?
I understand, yeah. We can
give
turn
users voting rights
the problem is
proportional to the riches they hoard on chain, we will just replicate plutocracy. Will wealthy people shrink from using their usual tools of law, advertisement, and favors when they sense that their crypto funds are threatened? They will be influencing the hell out of the community, and they might not even realize what is going on. Then there's the power of the programmers. At WeShare in 2016, a banker from the French Caisse de Dépôt warned how we are slipping into a world where a handful of obscure programmers.
All right, so I will give you access to the link at a later time. We were trying to bridge the time until Vlad gets access to the session. He's still at the airport. Yeah. So we just received a question from the audience about what Bitcoin actually is. And so this is also how this session is supposed to function. It's supposed to be being open to all questions at any time. And so the structure is not fixed, and anyone of the online audience as well can ask questions. And we will try to answer them as duly as possible. Regarding the classification of Bitcoin, I read a definition recently, which I think is the one which probably comes closest. And it is, Bitcoin is digital gold with a payment function. And so this is something which I actually think is oftentimes overlooked, because Bitcoin is used as a means to store value as it is currently deployed in most cases, because few people, because of the transaction cost involved and the constant going up and down of the price, use it as a means of payment, because its functionality and utility as a means of payment currently is very much decreased, I would argue. I hope this will answer. Yeah. So,
hi, I'm a diplomat here in Geneva and working with a few people thinking about how blockchain can be used in different aspects of what Geneva does, such as refugees and different kinds of uses for that. And this would be an unfortunate miss, I would think, that if we focus blockchain session during an IGF on Bitcoin again, and if we keep to the basics. I think that most people here at least know what blockchain is. For those who don't, it's a distributed immutable ledger. Those three words are, I think, key. So at least I think it's a good start to thinking what deserves to be on such a distributed immutable ledger and what doesn't. What are things that deserve such permanence so that we can start thinking about their uses, and what is possibly not a good use to have such permanence of the record. So I don't know, throwing a question here, and perhaps there's thoughts in the room on that. But I would really not think that we should focus on Bitcoin or,
I fully agree. We shouldn't focus on Bitcoin here. And I think it's a very good question. It's probably a fundamental question that you ask. And so, come again. So the intent is to get Vlad still online. He's downloading the program, and then what we want to do is really explore blockchain governance, because this is something which will have implications to the way other governance structure work. And so we try to stay very high level, knowing that not everybody has the same knowledge of blockchain technology, and we don't want to go in too deep. However, I actually fully agree with your proposal. I think in the meanwhile, until Vlad gets on stage, I don't mind having this as an open discussion to clear some questions or issues that are in people's minds when it comes to blockchain. And we can try to limit that maybe, but sure, let's open the floor.
So, since the beginning of the session, there's been a lot of focus on Ethereum, but there are other technologies out there and that may be more advanced or function a little bit differently. Some are decentralized and some are maybe a little more centralized. Maybe Ethereum could be considered like the MS-DOS of the blockchain, and there might be new technologies, more advanced, more open, that will ease the access of smart contracts or the development of or speed of transactions. So it's very difficult to focus on what Ethereum does just now. Maybe look at take a broader picture and consider this as at the beginning of the internet, when there were multiple number of protocols and someone had to step in and suggest a protocol. Does the birth of ICANN and the role of Windsurf. Maybe that's something that we should be looking at as a model.
This is definitely very interesting. So we wanted to explore at a further stage whether the introduction of an institution such as ICANN for blockchain, blockchain governance would make sense. And so clearly, because the focus remained on the Ethereum blockchain, at least from the structure at first, because of Vlad. And but it shall definitely not be limited to that, because whatever we find shall govern a ideal blockchain should be able to be used for other blockchains as well. So, and I fully agree with you. The Ethereum blockchain has some limitations, and it will be seen in the future whether it will prevail the way it does. But I think, talking to Vlad, I'm pretty confident that they will be able to deal with their scalability issues that they have and the transaction cost issues they have, especially with the introduction of the proof-of-stake algorithm. So he says he's trying to call, but his data is not working. Absolutely. So, but anybody, just please.
My name is Siva Subramaniam. I'm from the Internet Society India, Chennai. I just wanted to ask you why you are making a distinction between blockchain governance and internet governance. Blockchain is an internet technology. It runs on the internet, and shouldn't it be broadly considered as part of internet governance? And what actually is the idea behind making a distinction between blockchain governance and internet governance? Is there a separate governance ecosystem that is being conceived for blockchain? And what are the pros and cons? Shouldn't it be part of the open global internet governance process, perhaps with a separate stream of attention?
I think it's a fair question, and you're certainly right with regards to the fact that the blockchain is run on the internet. However, I do feel that it's a distinct set of it's a distinct class of governance. If you look at it, and then there's one definition of general governance, what governance means, and stemming from the Latin gubernare, I mean to govern. It relates to the process of interaction and decision making among actors which are involved in the solution of a collective problem, and in order to solve to this problem, they create, reinforce, or reproduce some form of social or hard norms and institutions. And so the question, if you ask how to govern blockchains, is an entirely different question of how the internet is governed, because we talk about the structural level here. So in the internet governance, you have a process which underlies the decision making. You have institutions such as the ICANN, for example, and they want to solve collectively problems which pertain to each participant. And you have the same thing, just on a smaller level in the blockchain, but it is different from the way that the internet is governed. Sure.
My name is Jon Erbgut. I'm doing a PhD on blockchain governance. And I think there's a need for governance on blockchain because immutability is not always the best thing. On the other hand, if we introduce some kind of central governance, then we just destroy the value of blockchain. So we need to introduce some kind of distributed governance for blockchains. And I think we can use even blockchain to manage this kind of distributed governance. And I think, currently we have got hard forks. It's kind of a very rudimentary governance process. But this can be improved quite a bit to have something that is able to address issues that might arise due to bugs, might arise due to stolen keys, whatever issue that needs to be resolved. We need to have some kind of governance structure, but that is a governance structure that is compatible to blockchain, and that's not just imposed by some government on blockchain.
Absolutely, I definitely agree with that notion. The very important distinction also here to be made is how you want to achieve this common objective, right? Because you just mentioned some of the problems, losing of the keys, the hard forks happening, etc. And we, or the participants of the blockchain, want to collectively solve that problem. And now the question is, and that's a very big debate going on right now, regarding how much of that you want to have on-chain. So the governance of these problems is encoded in the protocol, whereas would you rather have the governance of this off-chain? And so there have been very interesting discussions between Vlad and Fred Erzam, who's the founder of Coinbase, on the emphasis on whether you want on-chain or off-chain governance. What do you think to that? What do you think of that?
I think we can have some on-chain governance, and of course, if there's a bug in the on-chain governance, then what do we need to do? So there will be a case where we need to have some off-chain governance, but we should strive to do as much as possible on-chain.
Okay, this is something where, so just to give you everybody maybe a quick summary of what the terminology here means. On-chain governance refers to the idea that the blockchain nodes automatically upgrade when an on-chain governance process decides on an upgrade, and that it's time to install it. Whereas off-chain governance, which is the current norm, at least for Bitcoin and Ethereum, a node operator has to consciously decide whether to install a hard fork to have his node be consensus compatible with the nodes of operators who also decided to install that hard fork. This is, I think, one of the main reasons why Vlad is of the opinion that on-chain governance is off-chain is very important and shall not be belittled, because it's this conscious decision of node operators to actually adapt or not to adapt, where with on-chain governance you would not have this conscious decision, and therefore making the system much more susceptible to fault, I think, by design.
Well, there is also the decision-making process that should be on-chain. So why do we need to have the voting, etc. off-chain? We can put it on-chain. And of course, then whether it should be automatically enforced or whether there should be some kind of human validation is a second question.
That's a good point. So in that case, you would have to at least make these or separate these, right? So you would have the voting mechanism on the protocol. You could have it on chain, you could have it on the blockchain, but it should be different from the protocol itself, at least, in order to prevent the previous danger that I mentioned.
Can be even a different chain.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there are many, yeah, sure. You in the back, yeah?
I think that you're de facto eliminating competing technologies that do not use the blockchain, like IOTA, which use tangles and which is a completely different technology, which is equally valid. And you have to put that in perspective of technology consumption or energy consumption. Bitcoin has increased its energy consumption in 1 month by 5 terawatts, which now is at the level of the consumption of energy of Denmark. Now, in 1 month, it increased, and now the consumption of Bitcoin is equal to the consumption of energy of Denmark. It's increasing, maybe not exponentially, but in a very dramatic way. If you add all the developments that are going on Ethereum and the energy consumption that will be required in order for those projects to develop and be used, then we're facing a major issue that we have to take into account as well. So technology aspects and energy consumptions cannot be separated.
Absolutely, and I think definitely if we want to talk about the implementation of blockchain on a global level to solve issues, we cannot separate it from the environmental issue, and therefore, I mean, just supporting Bitcoin itself is not something which, you know, one can really stand behind at the moment because of the environmental impact it has, and I fully agree with that. And you have that with many blockchain applications. You're right, and so we do focus too much in our discussion on this specific linear type of consensus mechanism, where you can have things which function completely different, like tangles. That is absolutely right, and they could have the same function in the end. Yes, you sir.
Sorry, go
ahead. My name is Claudio Lucena, Paraíba State University, FCT, Portugal, for the record. I just wanted to highlight that we're clearly benefiting more from, if we abstract the currency part of the discussion and take it to an institutional level. I think the knowledge that has been said in the beginning is enough for us to take this institutional approach of a technology that we believe can make a difference for governance. And I will take it back to the last discussion. When you talk about enforcement, on-chain enforcement, have you in the discussions envisaged a set or a subset of law enforcement measures that you believe for the time being should be kept off-chain for some reason?
No, so I'm actually not talking about anything related to law and enforcement of law. This is all either within the realm of the law or outside of it, but it's governance of a blockchain is a thing where people in the private realm, where the laws and regulations, at least now, don't have access to decide to build an ecosystem or system in order to transfer assets or other means of value. And so when it comes to blockchain governance, this still is not necessarily touched by laws and regulation, at least the governance process of it. And this doesn't really differ whether it's on-chain or off-chain. However, you could argue that whether this should be included in a regulation crypto, if we want to regulate blockchains, whether we also would want to regulate the governance processes involved in there. And then, of course, you would argue that probably to have it on-chain would somehow facilitate the enforcement for a legislator or an enforcement. Yeah.
So Monique Morrill, Humanized Internet. I have a question. I want to go back to the person who is a delegate and was talking about refugees. Can we talk about maybe proof of existence? When you have proof of existence, you have a registration of an identity. For example, you have people who may not have an identity or may not have papers. And so I think this would be an interesting use of blockchain as such, where you may have, if you're the United Nations Commission of High Refugees or whatever, you may have, and you will have cases where this is where that registration has to occur. So then you have something of the notion of proof of existence. You have a lot of, right now we have a lot of exchanges. We can talk mathematically about the cryptographic keys, but certainly this is a valid use case today.
This is exactly actually what we've been thinking about, and I've proposed this actually at UNHCR and IOM meetings exactly for this. I'll give you an example. I was in Macedonia a few years ago when we had a lot of refugees and migrants passing by. And this was one of the issues that we had refugees and migrants coming from a Schengen country, from Greece, into Macedonia, which is not a Schengen country. So sharing that kind of information was problematic. Now, I've proposed exactly thinking about blockchain for these kinds of things. The danger is that the positive thing is a refugee starts on a voyage and somehow records their ID, right? Puts it into a blockchain. And a lot of dangerous things can happen on the road. So they can lose their papers, etc. Many do. Some lose them deliberately, but still. The point is, it is in the blockchain. Now, that can also be abused, right? So there is an aspect of how do you protect it? How do you protect this person who has put in their documents so that that doesn't become a hazard at some point where somebody discovers their ethnicity or their sexuality or whatever it is and uses it against them at some point. So these are exactly the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. Now, in terms of another use, for instance, for UNHCR, what I've proposed is for land titles, land registries to be put in there, because one of the big issues with refugees is they want to come back home, and very often they cannot come to a climate of legality. So having a land that they know is theirs when they come back and recorded in some form for posterity is safety for them. But this is exactly the kinds of things that I think we should be thinking about. What deserves to be in a ledger, in a permanent record, and what doesn't, and what of which is put into such a ledger should be protected in what kinds of ways. And we keep on thinking about algorithms as proof of work, etc., but there's many other aspects of the consensus mechanism arising. A proof of stake that doesn't need to be algorithm-based. There can be other forms. And this is an exciting topic, I think, that we need to start exploring as well.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And the emphasis you put on here, I can fully stand behind, because as a society where we see this technology becoming more prevalent and prevalent, we as a society, the way that people decided how to govern or set up a governance structure for the internet, need to decide what information will actually be put on the ledger. I fully agree with that. And we should check out definitely at the use of technology such as zero knowledge proof, because we can, with zero knowledge proof, enable the security of information, at least at the same time have the functionality that the blockchain should have.
Hi, so I'm a student at Hong Kong, and I might not have the same technical knowledge as most of you, but I know that Bitcoin is this sort of platform where it can record these massive amounts of data and store these records. But the question that comes to my mind is whether we really even want this surveillance, or whether we even want this technology watching over us. And I just want to hear the thoughts around the room from what you guys think of this.
I'm Siva Subramaniam from Internet Society India, Chennai again. We talked about competing technologies. When we, as blockchain is in its early phase of development, there are so many competing technologies, and of these competing technologies, what are the technologies that are open, and what are the technologies that are closed, and what are proprietary and what are non-proprietary? And when we talk about open technologies, what technologies are at present open, what technologies are apparently open but have a potential to become proprietary? I'm thinking of scenarios wherein a database company promotes a certain technology which gets into the core of blockchain, and then there are proprietary models introduced to exploit the whole blockchain. And is anyone paying attention to that? Is the internet community paying attention to that? Is ICANN paying attention to that? Is the IGF paying attention to what technologies are being promoted and what ought to be promoted?
And anybody care to answer? I really, focus on blockchain technology in my work and the research I do. So I can't really make any assertions as to that. But anybody else care to give an answer to this and also to his answer, which hasn't been answered yet, I think? Can you repeat? I didn't hear it acoustic. I think this would actually be just a great question, and I'm going to have Vlad answer that, because it seems Vlad is now ready and he's set up to participate. And yeah, I guess I've already given a quick introduction to Vlad before. So Vlad, please take the stage. Did you hear the question that was asked? We're trying to turn up the volume, Vlad. Just 1 second. Can you guys hear it with them? Okay. Well, I guess they're still struggling with the technicality of it. I guess, Vlad, I'm sorry about it. It seems like we can hear you at a full level. So let's just try to open it again for the whole floor. Yeah.
On the surveillance aspect of it, I think that a lot of we've approached a new way of thinking about this for the past few years, and especially since the Snowden revelations. But I think that a lot of that is focused on what government surveilling, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that very little discussion has been made on the fact that a lot of private companies have more power than 2/3 or 3/4 of the states in the world, and the knowledge that they have is there. So it's not an aspect anymore of how the information is traveling and how much you can protect it. It's there, and you need to be smart about it if you want to really protect it, and just to be aware of how things are going. But I think what blockchain allows for is the decentralized aspect of it, in the sense that it's not staying on one server, whether it is some government agency or a private company. That the fact that it is distributed gives a sense of different ownership, and that can give a stake in the whole community of protecting that. And then it comes to the aspect of how do you protect it, and there are ways of doing that. If I have just 1 second for the microphone, there's one idea that I and a friend will propose. Actually, I've been on the MOG for a few years, and I've been in the WSIS process for the past 15 years or so for the preparations of the World Summit. And I've seen how this is the 12th IGF. A lot of knowledge has been built during the IGF that has not produced any tangible next steps. Whether it is on spam or whatever issue you take, every year we have all of these meetings and the same knowledge is kind of regurgitated. So one aspect of taking a look at the next IGF, and I think it's a good moment to do that, is to seek all of the knowledge that has been built and perhaps create an IGF blockchain. and put that into, and perhaps the MAG can be the consensus mechanism, the governance body or another body. We can think about that. But for us to find a way to get the best knowledge on the top and make something out of that, instead of just having all of these meetings every year and regurgitating the same issues. So
I think
this is an
really
idea
good.
that's going to come out, but I would love to get more and more minds to start thinking about what do we do with this knowledge, and how do we make it productive.
Fully agree with that. I mean, also this is open. Anybody who wants to join the work of the Dynamic Coalition is happy to notify us and just take part. Maybe it's a quick try to answer two of those aspects or give my input. One regarding the combat of fake news. I actually do think that blockchain technology has a great capability to combat fake news because in essence, blockchain technology is used to establish veracity. It's about veracity of information. And you don't need a trusted intermediary to establish this veracity, but you have a decentralized consensus mechanism in order to establish whether a certain information is true or false, or whether a certain person has access to something or not. And so we've had a discussion with also somebody of Twitter, how they want to combat fake news. And we talked about how they could actually use blockchain technology, where you would have a distributed ledger which would allow you to see whether a video that was posted, for example, was actually posted where it was portrayed to be recorded from, where it was recorded in the place where it was recorded from. The pictures could be verified by a community, etc. So there's a great use case for this. On the other hand, what you mentioned also, it's about ownership, and especially talking about GAFA and these Silicon Valley companies, which basically own all our private data. And blockchain allows us to reclaim sovereignty over our own personal data. And because it is a very paradox situation where you see that these companies, which have grown to become the largest companies in the world, use our resources, which we give them for free. And with blockchain technology, you could have, and there are many-fold use cases for this, and they're actually implemented already also in Switzerland, where I'm from, where they allow the user to reclaim sovereignty and decide on each moment when to display and disclose which data, personal data, and actually be remunerated for it. Yeah. So the session is closing actually very soon. What I would like to know from all the people in here who have a lot of knowledge on internet governance as well is how could blockchain governance experts or people involved in these decision-making processes learn from internet governance? Do you think blockchain governance would require the introduction of an institution such as ICANN? Do you think there should be global norms which should be introduced which govern blockchain? And how can we maintain the decentralized aspect of it?
Hi everyone. My name is Lori. I am from China. I think the governance we were discussing on blockchain is quite vital because we already see the Bitcoin like hard fork, what have already happened. But it's not just the governance we are talking about because the consensus, it's very, very difficult to reach. Even in the like cryptocurrency community, people's fighting for years and hard to reach the consensus. So when we think about the governance, I think we were like to reach how we can reach the consensus. But this kind of consensus is not the algorithm we were used in the one kind of blockchain. So I think this is these are two aspects. As you mentioned, whether we need the institutional organizations to involve, because I think the beauty of the blockchain is peer-to-peer. When it happens, it's really give the rights back to people. But also we use the technologies like encryption, this technology to protect it. So when we think about the governance, I think it's totally different from the previous one. But still, we need to drive to work together to find the way to how to make the governance system. And also, I am personally from the blockchain background industry, and also work in IGF China. So as you mentioned that we were thinking is also we want to initiative the collaboration among NRIs. I think blockchain is not just at the level of it's at the level of within one country, and also we see it beyond the border. So it should be the collaboration among the nations and the regionals and under the IGF platform. I think it's perfect. But also, I totally agree with this gentleman. You mentioned that there are just like we have we talk about a lot, but we still have very few practice or something to go into real. But I think blockchain is quite suitable or quite very suitable skill. The technology we can make the practice. Like you have already made the DC under blockchain under the IGF. I think it's very, very good, and we can promote more on the maybe based on the projects or something like that.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good input you give, especially the aspect that you emphasize. Blockchain was born global, and it's inherently global in every aspect of it. And you see how any national solutions for this, they fail in tackling blockchain, whether it's applications such as initial coin offerings, which cannot be, cannot be actually regulated on a national level. And if you just look at something on a cross-border level, such as a smart contract, if it has a legal value and it's an actual legal agreement, it is always in an international context. So in our national jurisdictions, you would hardly ever find even a court which would deem itself competent, because you wouldn't know the counterparty, and there's always people from different nations involved. There's the miners and node operators in different nations involved. And I think blockchain really shows that we need to find global solutions for this as a global community. And whether it just be at a supranational level, such as the European Union, also very much as you see how it tackles the problem of data protection with the GDPR. And if we want to come up with a regulation for at least cryptocurrencies, my background being financial market law, I think it's something we need to find on a global level, because I can tell you that we have a huge lack and void of regulation right now, and what the financial market regulators actually are here to do, which is consumer investor protection and to ensure a functioning financial market. This is not happening right now, and it's not happening in all of the nations, especially with regards to initial coin offerings and with regards to the secondary markets that these coins are being traded on. And so what we see how the regulators are struggling with it to come up with a national solution, and we see that the need to bring all of these regulators together to actually form and come up with a regulatory framework for the use of blockchain technology in its different use cases. And so this will also cover initial coin offerings, this will cover blockchain itself, this will cover smart contracts and privacy and identity.
Hello, may I?
Sure.
My name is
Please.
Pedro. I'm from the Institute for Research on Internet and Society from Brazil. I'd like to make just 2 comments on the questions you've asked and on the last questions made around here. Is that we're kind of in the peak of the blockchain and Bitcoin hype, and as such, we try to think of ways of applying the blockchain to everything, and we get really creative all the time. We want to use it because it's so nice. We want to create institutions to regulate it. We want to create forums for it. But really, I believe we should wait for the hype to pass. I'd like to make 2 parallels in that sense. For example, the Internet of Things hype, where everyone wanted to apply the Internet to everything. And then there's a cost to applying the Internet to everything, matters of data protection, security. And then in the end, people find out that maybe they want to connect their juicer or toaster to the Internet. You don't really need to go that far. Maybe the blockchain will figure out the same. And also the dot-com bubble. If you were to regulate the Internet based on the dot-com bubble in the 90s, we probably have a really different Internet right now. And the Bitcoin probably bubble, I'm sorry if someone disagrees, but it may be one. If we regulate it based on the results of this, we might get non-optimal results in the future. So I believe we still should actually watch the situation before actually making any more concrete institutions or regulations or even, I don't know, yeah.
So I agree with your aspect regarding the maybe introduction of new institutions such as that govern the internet or the Internet of Things, but I disagree with regards to regulation of cryptocurrencies, because currently there's millions of people who are lured into investing into cryptocurrencies, and they're going to lose money, and there is need for action from the regulators, and I think we shouldn't wait any longer for that. Maybe we can have a vote here, and at the same time we're going to try to get Vlad to give the last maybe answer later. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Plamen Rusev. I'm executive chairman of Webit Foundation, and I'm also supporting a number of the largest ICOs, advising on their success. And what I agree, one thing for sure. I just heard some people saying we're not in heaven, where I think we're in heaven, but there's a groovier place. And in order to reach there, I think that regulation is needed. But for the right regulation, we should be based on a regulation that builds trust, not a regulation that regulates. Because we've seen so much of that regulation that obviously creates the opposite of trust. So now with blockchain, I think we're all in this room, we are aware and we are 100% confident that the future is there. Some of the ICOs I've helped and I'm helping are basically changing the way we perceive the reality as of today, the way we collaborate, the way innovation happens. One of them is IOTA, for example, an amazing example of how you build a new concept of trust, and we're talking not about Bitcoin or anything else. The other one, hopefully very soon to be there, is a marketplace for artificial intelligence, and all this based on blockchain. So obviously we should not stop this amazing innovation that we see spurring around, and regulation must be very careful, but I agree with you, we need to start because it's already late.
I thank you very much. This is an amazing vote. I couldn't agree more, because I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not calling for the kind of regulation we currently have, because there is a lot of not smart regulation. If we look at the investor protection regulation in the European Union, which is endowed in the European Prospectus Directive, which has now turned into the regulation, which will mainly come into force in 2019. The objective is a nice objective. It's to make sure that any investor makes an informed decision. That's the only thing, in order to protect them when somebody issues transferable securities on the primary market. However, how it looks like in practice is the following. The market entry barrier is extremely high, and it costs about 150,000 euros to get a prospectus filed in Germany, for example, and actually nobody ends up reading it. So there's probably no investor who ends up reading this 250-page prospectus. Thus, the regulation doesn't reach its objective of making sure that every investor makes an informed decision. And this is something where I would propose for blockchain or cryptocurrency regulation, we can change that. We can, and that is with the concept of functional equivalence. If we use technology, whether it's blockchain-based or not blockchain-based, to ensure the objective of the regulation, I think there's a fair case to be made that the regulation itself could be lowered. So I wouldn't ask for anybody to actually introduce a 250-page prospectus when they want to do an ICO. However, if they want not to be subject to this regulation, and we assume it's a transferable security, they can show to the regulator that they have a technical system in place which ensures this objective. This is actually the whole subject of the paper that we're going to submit to the AMF in 3 days. And so you have the example of, rather than having the obligation to draft this prospectus, you could just introduce a simple test, and at its base is a 10-page document, and every investor has to pass the test in order to be able to invest. And you can store everything, every answer he gives on the ledger, and the test would just involve very simple questions such as what loss or profit has the company that you want to invest in incurred in the last financial year according to the audited financial report? What are the risks involved? And by that, you could use technology to reach the objective that a regulation wants. And I think this is definitely something that if we want to introduce regulation for blockchain, we need to use the technology itself, and we need to make sure it's smart regulation.
Well, concerning governments,
yeah. So this is the last one. You can finish, and we're going to wrap this up, right? We were supposed to finish 10 minutes ago.
I don't have to go ahead. I'm part of the next session as well. So.
Yes, I will put this on the DC site. Anyway, okay, guys, thank you very much, and sorry for the circumstances. It was everything unplanned. So yeah. Nu neemt u nog niet persoonlijk. Herr Wabel, oder? Eigenlijk ga je alweer het smart contract opzet toch lezen. Ja, ja, genau, ja. En meer zou ik nog hebben.
You know how we put something on screen? PowerPoint?
A lawyer at a private blockchain-based company, UK, but I'm part of this DC, the Coalition Blockchain.
We can put it here and then we will.
I'm interested in your activities and
Okay, sure. So what is it you do? Okay, it's very interesting. Cool. Yeah, I'll definitely take that. I don't have a
Can you put slides for the next session?
Thank you very much. Ich habe leider keins, aber sicher noch sehr gerne schicken. Ja. benedict.schuble@lücke.com.
Which one is it?
Regulation that's taking place because the companies that want to be established as respective companies to the ICO, they see the approval of FINMA, which was the
Tirem fotos, é só mais estranha que eu já...
It's regulating more or less the ICOs. And a number that we mentioned a number of Swiss ICOs that took place early in the year.
Is there internet?
Because they weren't
Yes, there is.
the authorization.
Are you going to stay here for this session? No, I fully agree. I mean, this regulator stamp of approval, but it has gotten to a point where it's very difficult now with